There are moments in history when heaven seems to lean close to the earth, when divine truth meets human longing in a way that changes everything. The Sermon on the Mount was one of those moments. It wasn't delivered in a grand temple or before kings and scholars, but on a quiet hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The air carried the scent of grass and salt. The breeze stirred the robes of those gathered, and the sun touched the land with gold. People came not for spectacle, but for meaning. Hungry hearts searching for something greater than the world had offered them. Crowds gathered, filling the slopes as far as the eye could see. They came from dusty roads and distant villages, bringing their pain, their hopes, their silent prayers. Among them were fishermen, widows, farmers, and children. People burdened by poverty, weariness, and the weight of life's uncertainty. They had heard of Jesus, the teacher whose words healed hearts and whose presence brought peace. Something about him drew them, not the sound of religion, but the promise of truth that spoke directly to the soul. When Jesus stood upon that hill, the crowd fell silent. He did not begin with shouts or proclamations of power. His voice was calm, steady, and full of compassion. Every word he spoke felt alive, carrying a presence that stirred the heart. He looked at the people not as a crowd, but as individuals known and loved. Those who felt invisible suddenly felt seen. Those who felt unworthy sensed they belonged. The mountain, for that moment, became more than earth and stone. It became the meeting place between God and humanity. The message that flowed from his lips would forever reshape how people understood life, faith, and love. It was not a list of rules or commands, but a revelation of the heart of God, a vision of a kingdom not built on power, but on mercy, humility, and compassion. Every sentence challenged human pride and comforted human pain. His words lifted the lowly and humbled the proud, showing that the greatest treasures are not stored in wealth or status, but in a pure heart, a forgiving spirit, and a faith that trusts even when storms rise. Those who stood there could not have known how far those words would travel, across lands, languages, and generations. Yet here we are, centuries later, still drawn to that same mountain, still listening to the same voice. The Sermon on the Mount is not history alone. It is living truth, still speaking, still transforming, still calling us to a higher way of being. Each phrase holds an invitation, not just to hear, but to live differently, to build life upon something that no wind or storm can destroy. If this message inspires you and you enjoy reflections like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every interaction helps this message reach more people who need a moment of peace and light in their day. Faces filled the hillside like waves upon the shore, each carrying its own story of struggle and longing. Some had walked for miles beneath the scorching sun, others had left behind fields unharvested, and families waiting at home, driven by an inner pull stronger than reason. Their sandals were worn, their clothes simple, yet in their eyes flickered a deep yearning that went beyond the need for food or healing. What drew them was not curiosity alone, but hunger, a hunger of the soul, unspoken yet unmistakable. Many had heard whispers about this man who healed the sick and spoke with authority that defied the teachings of the scribes. They came because somewhere within they sensed that his words might reach places no remedy or ritual ever had. Among them stood fishermen who had tasted the disappointment of empty nets, widows who carried the silence of loss, and laborers whose backs bore the marks of endless toil. The poor and forgotten, those often pushed to the margins of society, filled the slopes with quiet expectation. Yet woven among them were also the curious, merchants, travelers, even a few religious men, unsure what to make of the rumors that had begun spreading like wildfire across the region. Each person came searching for something: hope, truth, meaning, forgiveness, and though their reasons differed, their need was the same. They came because life, as they knew it, had left them unsatisfied. The land they inhabited was heavy with tension and weariness. Roman soldiers patrolled the roads, their presence a constant reminder of oppression. Taxes were crushing, and the people's faith, though strong, was weighed down by the burdens imposed by religious leaders who turned devotion into a performance of rules. The temple system had grown distant from the hearts of ordinary people, and prayer often felt more like obligation than communion. Beneath that heaviness grew a quiet despair, a collective longing for freedom, not only from political chains, but from the emptiness that comes when the soul has forgotten its true home. Into that longing stepped Jesus, not as a revolutionary wielding power, but as a teacher whose words carried the fragrance of eternity. As the crowd pressed closer, the air became thick with anticipation. They did not know what they were about to hear, but something in his presence already filled them with a strange peace. He looked upon them, not as an audience, but as a flock in need of a shepherd, as hearts waiting to be nourished. His eyes held both compassion and challenge, as though he saw not only who they were, but who they could become. No one felt invisible under his gaze. Even the most broken soul sensed that they were fully seen and still fully loved. Everywhere one looked, there were hands clasped in prayer, faces lifted toward the speaker, eyes wet with emotion. Some leaned forward eagerly, others wept quietly, and children nestled beside their parents, absorbing the moment without understanding its weight. The energy was not one of spectacle or frenzy, but of deep stillness, a holy anticipation that something within them was about to awaken. They were not simply gathered to witness a miracle. They had come to receive meaning, to hear truth that could make sense of their pain. That gathering of humanity mirrored the condition of every heart that has ever reached for God. Each person, whether aware of it or not, carries that same hunger to be understood, to find purpose, to know that suffering is not the end of the story. The crowd on that mountain became the image of all who search for divine light in a world shadowed by confusion and fear. They were the poor in spirit before the words were even spoken, the mourners before they heard they would be comforted, the meek before they were promised inheritance. In their need, they had already stepped into the very blessings they had yet to hear. Somewhere in that multitude, perhaps a mother held her child closer, whispering a prayer for a better future. A man, haunted by regret, may have stared at the ground, hoping that forgiveness was possible. A young girl, weary of injustice, might have lifted her eyes, wondering if love could ever truly triumph over cruelty. They all carried questions that no priest or ruler had been able to answer. Yet they stood together in silence, hearts open to the one who would speak words of eternal clarity. When Jesus finally began to speak, his voice carried not only through the air, but into the depth of their being. Each sentence seemed to find its home in the hidden places of the heart. The poor heard dignity, the broken heard hope, the lost heard direction. The hungry crowd had come seeking something real, and they were about to receive more than they could have imagined. The bread they longed for was not of this world. It was truth, living, breathing, transformative truth that would fill the emptiness within them with a light that could never be taken away. When Jesus opened his mouth to speak, the first words he uttered carried the weight of eternity, wrapped in simplicity. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The crowd listened in silence, their minds trying to grasp a meaning that went against everything they had been taught. In a world where blessing was measured by wealth, power, and influence, these words sounded like a reversal of all human logic. Yet they felt right, resonating with something buried deep within the soul, a truth forgotten but now remembered. The kingdom of heaven, he said, belonged not to the proud or the successful, but to those who knew their need for God. Poverty of spirit became not a curse, but the doorway to divine abundance. Each phrase that followed built upon this new foundation, reshaping the way people understood life, faith, and value. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Those words reached into the hearts of the grieving and weary, not to erase their sorrow, but to transform it. Suffering, in his teaching, was not meaningless. It was the soil in which compassion and divine comfort take root. The mourners were no longer forgotten or cursed by misfortune. They were embraced by heaven itself. Through tears, they would come to see the nearness of God more clearly than the complacent ever could. When he spoke of the meek inheriting the earth, the crowd shifted uneasily. Meekness had never been considered a strength. The world honored the bold, the aggressive, those who fought their way to power. Yet here stood a man declaring that gentleness held the true key to dominion. It was a shocking thought, that humility could conquer what pride could never hold. The meek, those who surrendered their will to the higher purpose of God, would possess not merely land or title, but peace that outlasted every empire. The next words flowed like living water. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Those who longed for justice, who felt the ache of the world's brokenness, who yearned to see goodness restored, they were not to despair. Their longing itself was holy, a reflection of God's own heart. To hunger for righteousness was to be aligned with the pulse of heaven, and such hunger would never go unsatisfied. Mercy came next, and with it, a radical call to compassion. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. The people had known a religion of law and retribution, but this teaching introduced something altogether new. Mercy was not weakness. It was divine strength expressed in forgiveness. To forgive was to become like the Father, to release others and oneself from the chains of bitterness. The merciful became living mirrors of heaven's grace, receiving in return the same kindness they extended to others. When he declared, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," the words pierced like light through fog. Purity was no longer about ritual or external observance. It was about the condition of the soul. To see God was the highest human desire, and it belonged to those whose hearts were undivided, whose intentions were sincere. This vision of God was not a distant dream, but a present reality for those who walked in honesty and love. Peace followed purity, as he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." In a world torn by violence and vengeance, such words carried the power to heal generations of wounds. Peacemakers were not passive. They were builders of reconciliation, carriers of divine harmony. To make peace was to reflect the Creator's nature, to participate in the restoration of what sin had broken. The title, Sons of God, was not merely poetic. It was identity, bestowed upon those who brought light into division. When he finally spoke of persecution, the crowd grew still. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To suffer for doing good, to face rejection for truth, these too were signs of divine favor. The words turned pain into purpose, assuring the faithful that nothing endured for God's sake was ever wasted. Heaven itself stood beside those who bore injustice with steadfast hearts. Each beatitude unfolded like a doorway into the heart of divine reality. Together, they painted a portrait of a kingdom unlike any other, a realm where the last are first, the weak are strong, and the humble reign. The crowd had expected commandments. What they received was invitation. They were not being told what to do, but who to become. In those few sentences, Jesus unveiled the very nature of God's world, a world where love triumphs over pride, where sacrifice becomes glory, and where the truest blessing is found not in what one possesses, but in who one is within the gaze of the divine. When the murmurs of wonder faded after the Beatitudes, Jesus looked again at the faces before him, his expression both tender and resolute. He spoke words that would define the mission of those who followed him. "You are the salt of the earth." It was a simple image, yet rich with meaning. In those times, salt was precious, used not only to flavor food, but to preserve it, to keep what was good from decay. By calling them salt, he declared that their presence in the world was meant to preserve goodness, to hold back corruption, and to bring out the flavor of life as God intended. Their value did not lie in power or wealth, but in the quiet influence of integrity, kindness, and truth. He warned that salt could lose its savor, becoming useless and trampled underfoot. The people understood the warning well. Salt that lost its purity could no longer preserve or season. Likewise, faith without conviction, righteousness without sincerity, became powerless. The call was not only to believe, but to live in a way that preserved what was holy in the midst of a decaying culture. They were to remain distinct, not withdrawn from the world, but within it, influencing it with the light of divine character. Then his words shifted to another image just as powerful. "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." The crowd lifted their eyes to the surrounding hills, understanding the picture immediately. In the darkness of night, the light of a city guided travelers, offering direction and safety. Light revealed what was hidden and dispelled fear. By these words, Jesus was calling them to become beacons of hope in a world covered in shadow. Their faith was not meant to be concealed, their goodness not meant to be silent. They were to shine so that others, seeing their deeds, might glorify God. He spoke of lamps placed on stands rather than under baskets. Hiding light, he said, would defeat its purpose. Those who had received truth were not to retreat into secrecy or fear. They were called to live visibly, courageously, illuminating their surroundings not through dominance but through love. Every act of kindness, every word of truth, every gesture of compassion became a ray of that light, pushing back the darkness bit by bit. The people listened, understanding that he was describing a way of life that extended beyond belief into action. To be salt and light meant to embody divine presence in the ordinary, in the marketplace, in the home, in the fields. Influence was not limited to preachers or leaders. It belonged to every soul who carried faith into daily living. Each life could season its surroundings, preserving what was good and drawing others toward the source of light. These metaphors were both empowering and humbling. They affirmed human purpose while reminding all who heard that their strength came not from themselves, but from the divine fire within. Salt only transforms when it touches what it preserves, and light fulfills its calling only when it enters the darkness. Isolation and fear dimmed that purpose, while engagement and compassion made it shine brighter. Jesus was shaping a people not meant to withdraw from the world, but to change it from within. As his voice carried across the hillside, the meaning settled deep into their hearts. To follow him was not merely to learn a set of teachings, but to become instruments through which heaven could reach earth. Their faith was not private, not a treasure to be hidden in secret chambers of the soul, but a living witness that could awaken others to truth. Each listener was being entrusted with divine responsibility to reflect the goodness of God in a world desperate for light. Those words still echo through generations, calling believers to remember their purpose. To be salt is to keep love alive where bitterness reigns. To be light is to reveal hope where despair has settled. The world may forget divine truth, but it will remember the warmth of those who live it, and as long as hearts continue to shine with that inner flame, darkness will never have the final word. When Jesus began to speak about the law, the people grew silent again, for they knew how deeply it defined their lives. Every household, every marketplace, every moment of worship revolved around it. From birth, they had been taught to honor the commandments of Moses as the highest expression of righteousness. Yet, through the generations, something vital had been lost. Obedience had become performance, devotion had turned into duty, and holiness had been measured by external actions rather than inward purity. So when Jesus said, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them," he was not dismissing what was sacred. He was restoring it to its true meaning. He spoke not against the law itself, but against how it had been reduced to mere regulation, stripped of the compassion and purpose that gave it life. The law was meant to reveal God's heart, not to serve as a ladder for human pride. Every commandment, every statute had once been a window into divine justice and mercy. But over time, the focus had shifted from the spirit to the letter, from relationship to rule-keeping. When Jesus said he came to fulfill the law, he meant that in him, its deepest intent was being revealed, not rules written on stone, but truth inscribed upon the human heart. People had grown accustomed to measuring righteousness by outward conformity. If they avoided theft, they were honest. If they did not kill, they were good. If they gave offerings, they were generous. But beneath those actions often lay motives untouched by love, pride, resentment, self-interest. Jesus peeled away the surface to reveal what God had desired all along, a transformation that began within. The law was not a checklist of behaviors. It was a mirror reflecting the soul's true condition. Every word he spoke carried quiet authority. He was not replacing Moses. He was bringing the revelation to its completion. What had once been external now became internal. What had been obligation now became desire. Holiness was no longer about distance from impurity, but about closeness to God. The kingdom he spoke of was not sustained by rituals, but by love that fulfilled every command naturally, as a flame fulfills the purpose of light. Those who listened began to realize that righteousness was not something one could achieve through effort alone. It required surrender, a letting go of self-righteousness to receive a purity that flowed from divine presence. He said, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." To those accustomed to revering the religious elite, this sounded impossible. Yet he was not demanding perfection through effort. He was inviting them into transformation through grace. The righteousness of heaven could not be earned, only received, and once received, it would bear fruit through changed desires and renewed hearts. As his words spread across the hillside, the people began to sense that he was unveiling a faith not bound by law, but animated by love. He was calling them beyond compliance into communion, beyond obedience into intimacy. The commandments were not meant to restrain life, but to guide it toward wholeness. Every "you shall not" had always been a whisper of divine protection, not a barrier to joy, but a pathway to freedom. The heart that truly knew God would naturally walk in the way of goodness, not because it feared punishment, but because it delighted in righteousness. For generations, they had been told to guard their behavior. Now they were being asked to guard their hearts. Actions, he said, begin as thoughts. Sin grows in the soil of desire long before it bears visible fruit. To fulfill the law was to address its source, to let God purify intention, not merely correct action. The people realized that this was not an easier path, but a deeper one that demanded honesty with oneself, humility before others, and openness before God. Every sentence drew them closer to a truth they had long forgotten, that love was the fulfillment of all commandments. The law was never meant to enslave, but to teach humanity how to live in harmony with its Creator and with one another. Jesus had not come to tear down that structure, but to breathe life back into it. His words did not discard the old covenant. They transformed it into a living reality. What had once been a burden was becoming a promise, that through the renewal of the heart, the will of God could become not a demand but a joy. When Jesus turned his teaching toward anger, the tone shifted from the general to the deeply personal. He said, You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder.' But I say to you that anyone who is angry with his brother without cause will be subject to judgment." The crowd felt a ripple of surprise. Many had always believed that righteousness meant avoiding violent deeds, yet he was speaking of emotions hidden in the heart. He was reaching into the very root of violence, the silent rage, the grudges nurtured in secret, the harsh words that wound more deeply than a weapon ever could. He revealed that the seed of hatred carries the same poison as the act of killing. Anger, left unhealed, consumes the soul. It blinds judgment, distorts perception, and builds walls where reconciliation should grow. The people understood anger. They lived in a world filled with it, against oppressors, against neighbors, against fate. Yet he was not condemning emotion itself. He was calling for transformation. Righteous anger against injustice had its place, but bitterness, resentment, and pride destroyed the peace that God intended for the heart. His teaching was not abstract, it was practical and urgent. He said, "If you bring your gift to the altar and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. Go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come offer your gift." These words redefined worship. Relationship took precedence over ritual. Reconciliation mattered more than sacrifice. The divine presence could not dwell in a heart harboring hatred. Forgiveness became an act of holiness, a mirror of the mercy of God. The crowd listened, many remembering faces and names that stirred unease within them. His teaching demanded courage, not the courage to fight, but the courage to forgive. To lay aside pride and seek peace required strength far greater than vengeance. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was divine power expressed through humility. In forgiving, one was not excusing the wrong, but releasing the soul from the chains it forged. Those who carried bitterness were the ones most imprisoned by it. He painted a picture of what reconciliation looked like, not delayed, not postponed until emotions faded, but immediate and intentional. He urged them to make peace quickly with those who opposed them, warning that unresolved conflict grows into bondage. The longer anger remains unaddressed, the deeper its roots dig into the spirit. Freedom, he taught, begins when one chooses to let go, when mercy replaces judgment, when peace overcomes pride. The people who had come seeking comfort were discovering that the way of peace was both beautiful and demanding. Forgiveness was not a feeling but a choice, one that opened the soul to the healing touch of God. To release another was to set oneself free. Every heart that dared to forgive became a vessel of divine grace, carrying light into a world darkened by resentment. He spoke with such clarity that the truth became undeniable. Reconciliation is not optional for those who follow the way of heaven. A heart divided by hatred cannot fully receive love. A community fractured by bitterness cannot reflect God's kingdom. Peace begins not in treaties or laws, but in hearts willing to forgive. Those who carried grudges were like travelers burdened by stones. The moment they released them, they found themselves walking freely again. As the crowd absorbed his words, a new awareness stirred within them. They realized that holiness was not measured by outward devotion, but by the state of the heart toward others. Worship was not complete without reconciliation. To be right with God required being right with one another. Jesus was igniting a fire within them, a fire of love strong enough to burn away anger, pride, and resentment, leaving only the clear flame of peace. That fire, once kindled, would become the light by which the world could see the mercy of heaven reflected on earth. When Jesus began to speak about purity, the atmosphere grew even more introspective. He said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." His words reached beyond action into intention. exposing the inner desires that often hide behind a mask of respectability. He was not condemning the natural beauty of attraction or the bond of love, but unveiling the distortion that occurs when desire becomes selfish possession. In that culture, as in many since, purity was often reduced to behavior, measured by what could be seen or judged by others. Yet, Jesus was revealing that impurity begins long before the act, in thoughts unguarded, in glances that turn people into objects, in fantasies that erode the sanctity of the soul. He was speaking of the kind of purity that frees, not the kind that shames. His words carried both conviction and tenderness, calling people to remember that every person is made in the image of God and is worthy of honor. Purity of heart, as he described it, was not about repression, but about transformation. It was the ability to see others through the lens of love rather than desire, to cherish rather than consume. When love is pure, it gives rather than takes, it protects rather than exploits. Such purity restores dignity to relationships and harmony to the human heart. Lust, by contrast, blinds the eyes of the soul, reducing others to fragments rather than seeing them as whole beings loved by God. His teaching was not a restriction on joy, but a pathway to it. True joy in human connection could only exist where there was integrity, trust, and respect. Faithfulness was more than loyalty to one's spouse. It was loyalty to truth itself, to the sacredness of love in all its forms. Every covenant, every promise, every bond built on honesty became a reflection of divine faithfulness. To betray such trust was to wound not only another person, but one's own soul. He spoke of radical commitment, using vivid imagery about removing what causes sin, not as a call to harm the body, but as a plea to guard the soul. He was teaching that whatever leads the heart astray should be cast away without hesitation. The message was clear: nothing is worth the loss of purity, for purity is freedom, clarity, and peace. When the mind is pure, it sees truth clearly. When the heart is undivided, it rests in peace. The crowd began to understand that purity was not limited to one aspect of life, but touched everything: thought, speech, intention, relationship. It was not only about physical chastity, but about wholeness, about being the same person in private as in public, in thought as in action. Integrity was the thread that wove purity into daily life. Without integrity, even the appearance of righteousness became hollow. His teaching on faithfulness extended beyond marriage, reaching into the very core of human trust. Every promise kept, every commitment honored, became an act of worship. To remain true, even when no one is watching, was to live as a child of light. Infidelity of the heart, whether in relationships, work, or spiritual devotion, fragmented the soul. Faithfulness, on the other hand, restored unity, bringing the heart back to the stillness where divine love resides. Those who listened felt both challenged and comforted. They realized that Jesus was not placing impossible burdens upon them. He was offering a way to freedom from the torment of divided desires. His call to purity was not about perfection, but transformation, a continual turning of the heart toward love. Purity was not cold restraint, but radiant clarity, a heart that could see God in others and reflect His light without distortion. As His words settled into the hearts of the people, they began to sense that He was describing more than moral discipline. He was describing a life illuminated from within, where every thought, every gaze, every word became an expression of holiness. Purity of heart was not the absence of desire, but its redemption, a reordering of love so that it reflected heaven's design. To live with such integrity was to walk in the light, unafraid, to see others not through the haze of temptation, but through the brilliance of divine love. And those who walked that path would find peace, for they would begin to see God not only in sacred places but in every soul, every sunrise, every quiet act of faithfulness that reflected his image on earth. When Jesus spoke about oaths, his words reached into a matter both ordinary and profound. He said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'Do not swear falsely, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths you have made.' But I say to you, do not swear at all." His listeners were startled, for oaths were woven into their daily life, used to prove sincerity, to settle disputes, to affirm promises. Yet he was not condemning the practice of swearing alone. He was revealing something far deeper, that a person's word should be so trustworthy that no oath is ever required. Truth, he taught, should flow as naturally as breath, unadorned and unwavering. People of his time often swore by heaven, by the earth, by Jerusalem, or even by their own heads, believing that invoking sacred or powerful things made their words credible. But Jesus dismantled this illusion by pointing out that none of these things belonged to them. Heaven was God's throne, earth his footstool, and the human body itself his creation. To swear by anything was to claim authority one did not possess. True integrity did not need embellishment, for honesty is its own proof. The command was simple yet absolute. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. His teaching cut straight through the human tendency toward exaggeration, manipulation, and half-truths. Many had learned to shape their words to fit their advantage, to promise what they could not keep, to hide falsehood behind eloquence. Yet every distortion of truth, no matter how small, chipped away at the foundation of trust that holds society together. Jesus was calling for a purity of speech that reflected purity of heart, for words that could be trusted because they flowed from sincerity. To lie was to betray not just others, but oneself, to fracture the unity between heart and tongue. Integrity, he showed, was not only about avoiding falsehood, but about embracing consistency. The person of truth speaks the same in private as in public, in weakness as in strength. Such a person does not use words as shields or weapons, but as instruments of light. In a world where deceit had become a common tool, honesty shone like a rare gem. He was restoring speech to its divine purpose, to communicate truth, to build connection, to mirror the faithfulness of God who never breaks his word. Those who listened may have felt the weight of their own contradictions, promises made in haste, words spoken to impress, half-truths offered to escape judgment. His command was not a call to perfection of language, but to the alignment of soul and speech. When words match the heart, they carry power. A simple yes, when spoken from truth, can move mountains. A sincere no, when grounded in integrity, can guard against sin. The kingdom he described valued honesty not as moral decorum, but as spiritual strength. Speech, he implied, was sacred. Each word carried creative power, echoing the same divine breath that once spoke light into existence. When words were used to deceive, they distorted creation. When used truthfully, they brought healing and harmony. Every promise, every affirmation, every declaration had weight, for language was a gift entrusted to humanity to reflect the nature of its maker. The careless use of words was not merely social failure but spiritual decay. Those gathered on the hillside began to understand that truthfulness was not about rules of speech, but about the nature of the soul. The truthful heart does not need to defend itself with oaths or assurances. Its words are steady because its motives are pure. Such a person lives in freedom, unburdened by the need to remember lies or manipulate perception. Honesty becomes the natural language of peace. As his teachings settled upon them, they realized that he was not merely refining social ethics, but unveiling the foundation of trust upon which all relationships stand. Where honesty reigns, love can flourish. Where deceit hides, love withers. The call to speak truth was the call to live truth, to let every conversation, every promise, every vow reflect the light of a heart made whole. The power of honest words lies not in their eloquence, but in their purity. And when humanity rediscovers this, the voice of heaven can once again be heard in the simple yes and no of a faithful heart. When Jesus began to speak about retaliation, his listeners felt a mixture of confusion and resistance. The law of their fathers had taught an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a principle that once sought to limit vengeance, preventing escalating cycles of revenge. Yet he now declared, "Do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." To a people oppressed by foreign rule and often treated unjustly, these words sounded impossible. Yet beneath their surface lay a revolutionary power, the strength of mercy that transcends violence without surrendering to it. He was not calling for passivity or weakness, but for a strength rooted in peace. He was not calling for passivity or weakness, but for a strength rooted in peace. To turn the other cheek was to refuse to mirror hatred, to stand in dignity rather than descend into vengeance. The natural impulse to strike back, to defend pride, to demand repayment was being replaced by a divine courage, the courage to disarm evil by refusing its terms. Mercy, he revealed, was not soft. It was fierce. It required restraint when rage seemed justified, grace when punishment felt deserved. His teaching went beyond physical harm. It touched the deeper human instinct to retaliate in word, thought, or deed whenever wronged. To withhold retaliation was to declare that the cycle of hate would stop with oneself. This was not submission to evil, but defiance of it, a refusal to let darkness dictate one's actions. Every act of mercy became a declaration of spiritual freedom, a statement that the heart's peace could not be stolen by cruelty. He offered more examples, giving one's cloak when sued for a tunic, walking an extra mile when forced to walk one. These were not acts of defeat, but of authority, the quiet power of one who chooses love over fear. Under Roman law, a soldier could compel a civilian to carry his pack for a mile. To go beyond that was to reclaim one's dignity, turning a forced act into a voluntary gift. In doing so, the oppressed became the one in control, demonstrating that love cannot be coerced, only chosen. Those who heard these words may have felt the sharp edge of challenge within them. Mercy was not easy, and forgiveness did not come naturally. But Jesus was teaching that true strength lies not in domination, but in the mastery of self. Anger consumes those who wield it. Mercy liberates those who give it. To turn the other cheek was to remain undefiled by another's wrongdoing, to keep the heart unbroken by bitterness. He was unveiling a power that no empire could suppress, the moral authority of compassion. Empires fall by swords, but mercy endures beyond conquest. A heart that chooses grace over revenge stands with heaven's might behind it. The meekness he spoke of earlier was now taking shape in action, the quiet defiance of love that cannot be corrupted by hate. Many in the crowd had lived under injustice for years. Their wounds were deep, their anger understandable. Yet his words invited them into a freedom no oppressor could touch. To choose mercy was to rise above oppression, to declare that their spirit belonged to a higher kingdom. This mercy was not weakness, it was participation in divine strength, the same strength that forgives, heals, and redeems. Every listener who grasped this truth sensed that he was offering not a rule, but a way of life, a revolution of the heart. The call to turn the other cheek was not about denying pain, but transforming it into peace. When love meets hatred with grace, it exposes the emptiness of evil and reveals the invincible nature of goodness. Those who learn to respond this way carry within them the power to heal the world, one act of mercy at a time. When Jesus spoke the next words, the crowd drew closer, aware that he was reaching the summit of his teaching. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, Do good to those who hate you and pray for those who persecute you. No command could have been more unexpected, no idea more revolutionary. Every instinct of survival resisted it, for to love an enemy seemed unnatural, even dangerous. Yet he spoke these words with calm authority, as if unveiling the very essence of divine love itself. To love one's neighbor was already difficult. To love an enemy seemed beyond human reach. Yet Jesus was not appealing to ordinary strength, but to divine nature. He was revealing that love, at its truest, does not depend on the worthiness of its object, but flows from the goodness of its source. God's love shines upon the righteous and the unrighteous alike, offering light and rain to all. To love one's enemies, then, was to live as children of that same God, reflecting his impartial grace. His listeners lived in a world divided by hatred, Jews against Romans, zealots against tax collectors, rich against poor. Each group guarded its boundaries and justified its disdain. By commanding love for enemies, Jesus was tearing down the invisible walls that kept humanity fractured. He was showing that hatred sustains the world's brokenness, but love alone has power to heal it. When love meets hostility, it disarms it. When love meets cruelty, it transforms it. Such love was not sentimental, but sacrificial. It asked more than tolerance. It called for blessing those who caused harm. To pray for persecutors was to place one's pain before God and respond not with vengeance, but intercession. This kind of prayer did not excuse injustice, but overcame it by refusing to let hatred rule the heart. Those who loved their enemies were not naive. They were courageous enough to confront evil without becoming it. He was painting a vision of humanity restored to its divine image. To love an enemy was to see beyond actions and glimpse the soul still capable of redemption. It was to remember that even the cruel are not beyond grace, that forgiveness holds power to awaken what violence has buried. Such love does not ignore wrong, but answers it with a greater good. It is love that seeks to heal where the world seeks to punish. The challenge of this teaching struck deeply into the hearts of his audience. Many had suffered injustice firsthand. They carried the bitterness of oppression, the grief of betrayal, the wounds of humiliation. Yet he spoke of a love that could set them free, a love that could no longer be enslaved by resentment. To love one's enemy was not to condone evil, but to rise above it, to reclaim the dignity that hatred had stolen. His teaching revealed that divine perfection is not found in flawless behavior, but in boundless compassion. Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. This perfection was not about moral superiority, but wholeness, a heart undivided by hate, a soul complete in mercy. To love enemies was to live in that perfection, to reflect the completeness of God's own love that embraces the undeserving without measure. As the sun lowered over the Galilean hills, his words settled upon the crowd like golden light. Those who understood felt their hearts pierced yet lifted. They realized that he was describing a new kind of power, the power to love beyond limits, to forgive what seems unforgivable, to pray for those who wound, and in doing so, to reveal the very heart of heaven. Such love would not only change relationships, it would change the world, one heart at a time, until hatred itself had no place left to stand. When Jesus began to speak about giving, his words touched the very center of religious life. Acts of charity were common among the people, yet many had turned generosity into performance. He said, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness before others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." Those words cut through the layers of pretense that had grown thick around human piety. Giving was meant to be an act of love, not a display of virtue. The value of a gift did not lie in its size, but in its sincerity. He described how some gave with trumpets of self-importance, seeking admiration from others. The crowd could picture it vividly. wealthy donors announcing their charity at temple gates, their gestures large, their smiles practiced, their hearts hungry for praise. But Jesus spoke of a different kind of giving, one that took place in silence. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. The image was striking, painting generosity as something so natural and quiet that even one's own awareness should not linger upon it. True giving was not an event to be remembered, but an overflow of love that asked for nothing in return. He revealed that the Father who sees in secret rewards openly, not with applause or reputation, but with joy that no recognition can equal. The reward of secret giving was not material, it was spiritual. The deep peace of knowing that love had been expressed without corruption. To give unseen was to participate in the hidden nature of divine goodness, for God himself gives constantly, the sun that warms the unjust, the rain that nourishes the ungrateful, yet never boasts of it. Generosity that remains unseen mirrors heaven's own rhythm. His words reached into the motives behind every act of kindness. Charity, he said, must flow from compassion, not from the desire to appear righteous. When giving becomes a means of self-promotion, it ceases to be love. The outward act may remain, but the inward purity is lost. Those who give for attention already receive their reward, fleeting admiration that fades as quickly as it comes. But those who give in secret partake in eternity, for love, hidden in humility, never perishes. He was not condemning the act of giving publicly when necessary, but the heart that craves validation. Every motive matters, for it shapes the spirit of the deed. A coin dropped quietly into a beggar's hand carries more weight in heaven than gold offered with pride. In the silence of humility, generosity becomes holy. The one who gives unseen walks closely with the unseen God. The crowd began to understand that the kingdom Jesus spoke of was built not by grand gestures, but by secret faithfulness. The greatest works were often invisible. Prayers whispered in solitude, hands extended in quiet compassion, sacrifices made without witness. Every hidden act of goodness became a seed of divine light, growing in the unseen soil of the heart. The measure of righteousness was not how much one gave, but how much love was carried in the giving. He was calling his listeners into a life of authenticity, where deeds matched intentions and goodness flowed freely, unchained from pride. To give in secret required trust, faith that God sees what others cannot, that no act of kindness goes unnoticed in his sight. Such trust freed the giver from the need for human approval, anchoring them instead in the pleasure of heaven. As his words lingered in the air, the people realized that true righteousness thrives not in public acclaim, but in sacred secrecy. The quiet giver becomes a vessel of grace, moving unseen through the world, leaving behind traces of love that only God can fully measure. In that hiddenness lies the beauty of divine imitation, to love as the Creator loves, quietly, faithfully, endlessly. When Jesus turned his attention to prayer, the crowd listened intently, for prayer was at the heart of their faith. Yet he spoke not to instruct them in new rituals, but to restore the intimacy that prayer was always meant to hold. He said, "When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love to pray standing in synagogues and on street corners to be seen by men." His voice carried both gentleness and authority, exposing how easily even prayer could be twisted into performance. True communion with God, he said, happens in secret, behind closed doors, in the quiet space where the soul meets its maker without witnesses. He described the Father who sees what is done in secret and who hears not the many words of the proud, but the quiet sighs of the sincere. Long recitations and lofty phrases did not impress heaven. It was the honesty of the heart that reached God's ear. He was not condemning communal prayer, but correcting the vanity that had crept into it. For prayer is not a stage. It is a sanctuary, a place of truth stripped of pretense. Then he offered them words that would reshape the spiritual language of the world. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. With those few words, he redefined the relationship between humanity and God. To call God Father was to enter into intimacy with the infinite, to recognize both closeness and reverence. The prayer began not with requests, but with adoration, an acknowledgement that holiness belongs to God alone. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. In those lines, he united heaven and earth, teaching that prayer is not merely asking for divine intervention, but aligning the human will with the divine purpose. It was a surrender spoken in trust, a willingness to let God's plans take shape through human hearts. Prayer, he revealed, was less about changing circumstances and more about transforming souls until heaven's order was reflected in earthly lives. Give us this day our daily bread. These words carried both simplicity and depth. They spoke of dependence, of trust in divine provision, not for abundance, but for sufficiency. The people who lived day by day, uncertain of tomorrow's food, found comfort in that plea. It reminded them that God's care was not distant or abstract, but immediate, as close as the bread upon their tables. Gratitude became the rhythm of faith. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. With this petition came the bridge between mercy received and mercy given. Forgiveness could not be hoarded. It flowed like water, cleansing both giver and receiver. To be forgiven was to be invited into the same grace toward others. Every grudge released opened the heart to divine compassion, for unforgiveness clogs the channels of grace. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. These final words acknowledged human frailty and divine strength. They were not born of fear, but of humility, an awareness that without divine guidance, the soul easily loses its way. Deliverance was not escape from suffering, but preservation of faith within it. To pray these words was to confess dependence, not despair. When he finished, there was silence on the hillside. The people sensed they had been given more than a prayer. They had been given a path. It was short enough for a child to memorize, yet deep enough to contain the wisdom of eternity. The Lord's Prayer was not meant to be recited without thought, but lived word by word. Every phrase was a doorway into divine relationship. Reverence, surrender, trust, forgiveness, and protection. He had transformed prayer from duty into delight, from ritual into relationship. Those who prayed as he taught would find themselves drawn into the presence of God, not as servants approaching a distant master, but as children coming home. Prayer in his teaching was no longer a transaction, but a transformation. The meeting place where heaven's love reshaped the human heart until it began to mirror its Father. When Jesus began to speak about wealth, his words struck at the very desires that often rule the human heart. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth," he said, "where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but store up treasures in heaven." The crowd grew thoughtful, for they knew well the anxiety of survival, the fear of loss, the endless pursuit of more. Yet he was not condemning possessions themselves, but exposing the illusion that security could be built upon them. What is gathered in this world fades. What is given to heaven endures. He reminded them that the heart always follows what it treasures. Where one's wealth rests, there also rests one's devotion. To build life upon material gain is to anchor the soul in what time will inevitably take away. True treasure is not found in possessions, but in goodness, faith, and love, in acts of mercy and trust that reach beyond the grasp of decay. Every generous deed, every prayer offered in faith, every act of compassion becomes eternal currency in the economy of heaven. He said, The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. These words pointed to perception, to focus. When one's vision is fixed on divine truth, clarity fills the soul. When it is clouded by greed or envy, darkness settles within. What the heart desires determines what the eyes see. A person consumed by wealth sees scarcity everywhere. A person content in God sees abundance even in little. He continued, "No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money." The statement fell heavy upon the crowd, for they knew the pull of both. Wealth promises power, comfort, and control, yet it often demands allegiance at the cost of peace. To serve God is to trust. To serve wealth is to fear. One enslaves the heart with worry, the other frees it through faith. The contrast was absolute. Devotion cannot be divided. He turned then to the subject of worry, knowing how deeply it plagued the human spirit. "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink or what you will wear." The people looked at one another, some smiling faintly, others uneasy. Life was hard, hunger was real. Yet he spoke with such serenity that his words carried weight beyond reason. He pointed to the birds of the air, cared for without sowing or reaping, and to the lilies of the field, clothed in beauty without effort. Creation itself was living proof of divine care. He was not calling them to carelessness, but to confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing they are seen and sustained by a loving Father. "Worry," he said, "cannot add a single hour to life. It steals joy, blurs vision, and replaces gratitude with fear. Faith, however, restores clarity, reminding the heart that its worth does not depend on possessions or achievements, but on divine love that never fades. He invited them to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, assuring them that all other needs would be provided. This was not a dismissal of responsibility, but a redirection of priority. When the heart is aligned with heaven, earthly needs find their place without ruling the soul. The person who seeks righteousness finds contentment that wealth can never buy. As his words flowed over the crowd, a quiet peace began to settle among them. Many who had come burdened by worry now felt the weight lifting. They understood that faith was not blindness to reality, but sight restored to see reality through the lens of trust. Treasures in heaven were not distant dreams but daily choices, generosity over greed, peace over fear, worship over worry. He was not teaching them to abandon the world, but to see it rightly, as a gift, not a god. Wealth, when held lightly, becomes a tool of love. When gripped tightly, it becomes a chain. Freedom lies not in ownership, but in surrender, in living with open hands and a trusting heart. As the people listened, they could feel that he was offering them something far greater than riches, the unshakable peace of those whose treasure lies where time cannot reach, and whose hearts rest safely in the care of heaven. When Jesus spoke about the path that leads to life, his tone carried both tenderness and urgency. He said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." His listeners knew the meaning of paths, the well-trodden roads that connected villages, the trails that twisted through hills. Yet the road he spoke of was spiritual, unseen by the eyes, but clearly felt within the heart. It was not a path of comfort, but of commitment, not a route of ease, but of faithfulness. He was describing the choice every soul must make, between the wide road that promises freedom yet ends in emptiness, and the narrow way that demands surrender but leads to peace. The wide path invites the crowd, its journey effortless, its appeal strong. It asks nothing of the traveler, but eventually takes everything. The narrow way, however, is quiet and unadorned, often overlooked, sometimes ridiculed, but it carries a strange and lasting joy. To walk it is to resist the pull of the world, to choose integrity when deceit is easier, compassion when indifference is common, humility when pride reigns. Those listening could feel the truth pressing upon their hearts. Many had walked paths of ambition, revenge, and self-interest, believing them to be the way to success. Yet they knew such roads left them weary. The narrow path Jesus described was not a punishment, but a rescue, guiding souls away from what destroys and toward what restores. It was the path of devotion, a steady movement toward God, one step at a time, through choices made in secret and sacrifices unseen. He warned that the broad way often appears attractive, lined with voices that promise pleasure, status, and satisfaction. Yet beneath its surface lies restlessness, for it feeds the ego but starves the spirit. The narrow way, by contrast, strips away falsehood and pride, leaving the soul raw but free. Those who walk it discover a strength unknown to the comfortable, a joy that the world cannot counterfeit. Every hardship becomes a teacher, every obstacle a doorway to deeper faith. He spoke not to discourage, but to prepare his followers for reality. The narrow path would not always be admired. It might lead through rejection, misunderstanding, and sacrifice. Yet he promised that this path, though lonely at times, is filled with divine companionship. To choose it is to walk with God, to share in his heart, to reflect his light in a world that often prefers darkness. The reward is not only future glory, but present peace, a steady confidence that one's steps are guided by truth. He urged discernment, for many roads masquerade as the path of life. Not every teaching that sounds holy carries heaven's spirit. Not every crowd that claims faith walks in obedience. The narrow way demands wisdom, the kind that listens more to the whisper of God than to the noise of men. It calls for a heart that can distinguish between what pleases the moment and what pleases eternity. Discernment is not suspicion. It is clarity born from intimacy with the divine. Those who follow this path soon realize that it is less about where one walks and more about how one walks. Each step is marked by devotion, honesty when lying would be easier, love when resentment tempts, service when selfishness beckons. The journey becomes a continual act of surrender, a daily choosing of truth over convenience. And though the gate is narrow, the horizon it opens to is wide beyond measure, filled with light that the traveler could not have imagined before entering. The people listening to him that day were faced with a decision not unlike the one every heart faces now. To follow the narrow way is to move against the flow, to live differently in a world that measures worth by ease and approval. Yet those who take that road find what the multitudes miss, a freedom not bound by circumstance, a joy not dependent on success, a life rooted in divine purpose. The narrow way may seem small, but it leads to a love so vast that even eternity will not exhaust its wonder. When Jesus spoke of false prophets, his voice carried the sharpness of warning and the compassion of a shepherd guarding his flock. "Beware of false prophets," he said, "who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." His listeners understood the image well. Shepherds were familiar figures in their land, their work vital to the safety of their sheep. Wolves were their greatest threat, cunning, patient, waiting for a moment of weakness. Yet the danger he described was not physical but spiritual, more deceptive than open hostility. He was revealing that deception often hides beneath appearances of goodness. False prophets do not always announce themselves through error or evil. They often wear the disguise of sincerity. Their words may sound noble, their manner gentle, yet their motives feed upon pride and power. Such people twist divine truth to suit human desires, leading others not toward righteousness, but toward self-serving comfort. They promise blessings without obedience, salvation without surrender, glory without sacrifice. He told his listeners that such deception could be recognized not by eloquence, but by fruit. "You will know them by their fruits," he said. "Just as a healthy tree bears good fruit and a diseased tree produces corruption, so too do hearts reveal their nature through the results of their lives. Words may charm, appearances may deceive, but the fruits, humility, honesty, mercy, patience, never lie. Where the Spirit reigns, peace and integrity grow. Where deceit rules, confusion and division follow." He was teaching discernment that went beyond intellect. Recognizing falsehood required not cleverness, but purity of heart. Those attuned to truth through love would sense when something holy had been imitated without substance. The counterfeit may glitter, but it lacks the warmth of genuine faith. A false prophet can stir excitement, but cannot sustain peace. The wisdom he offered was not suspicion toward all, but sensitivity to the quiet resonance of divine truth within. The people may have thought of teachers who sought praise rather than service, of leaders who burdened others with rules they themselves would not bear. Jesus was not merely speaking of ancient figures, but of a danger present in every generation. The temptation to follow voices that tell us what we wish to hear instead of what we need to hear. False prophets thrive where hearts crave comfort more than truth, where the crowd prefers flattery over repentance. He also warned that not all deception comes from others. Sometimes it begins within. The human heart can deceive itself, mistaking emotion for faith, popularity for calling, self-interest for devotion. To guard against false prophets, one must first guard against the falsehood within, pride disguised as passion, ambition dressed as zeal. The same discernment that tests others must test one's own motives. Only in humility can truth be seen clearly. His teaching reminded the crowd that genuine faith will always produce good fruit, even when unseen. The life rooted in God's love does not seek applause, does not manipulate, does not exploit. It nurtures, uplifts, and restores. The contrast between the false and the true becomes clear over time, for counterfeit light fades quickly while genuine light endures. Patience becomes part of discernment, time revealing what words and appearances cannot. Those who heard him that day understood that the warning was not born of fear, but of love. He desired his followers to live anchored in truth, immune to manipulation. The kingdom he proclaimed was not built by charisma or spectacle, but by authenticity. False prophets may build crowds, but they cannot build character. Only truth can form a heart strong enough to endure trials and remain faithful. As his words lingered in the hearts of his listeners, they realized that discernment was not a gift for a few, but a calling for all. Every believer was invited to live so closely to truth that deception could no longer find room to take root. The wolf's disguise would lose its power when hearts learn to recognize the shepherd's voice, a voice that speaks not of self-promotion or fear, but of love, peace, and enduring grace. Those who listen to that voice walk safely, for they have learned to recognize the sound of truth, even amid the noise of falsehood. When Jesus reached the final part of his message, his words took the form of a story, simple enough for every listener to understand, yet profound enough to remain engraved upon the soul. He said, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. The rain came down, the floods rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock." The image was vivid, born of everyday life in Galilee, where sudden storms often swept through the valleys. Everyone knew the danger of building on sand, where beauty could not compensate for fragility. His story was not about architecture, but about the structure of the soul. He was drawing a clear line between hearing and doing, between admiration and obedience. Many in the crowd were captivated by his words, but he reminded them that hearing truth was not enough. Wisdom was proven not by knowledge, but by action. The foundation of faith is not emotion stirred by inspiration, but obedience shaped by love. The person who listens and lives according to his teaching stands firm through every storm, while the one who listens but ignores becomes like the builder who chose sand, impressive for a moment, ruined by the first wave. The storm in his story symbolized the trials of life, suffering, loss, temptation, injustice. Every soul faces them sooner or later, and when they come, they reveal what cannot be seen in calm weather. The true strength of a person is not measured in peace, but in perseverance. Those who build on rock may tremble, but they do not collapse. Their faith holds not because storms are absent, but because their foundation is unshakable. He was calling his listeners to authenticity. Religion built on routine, belief without transformation, devotion without action. All of these were sand. What mattered was not how loudly one proclaimed faith, but how faithfully one lived it when no one was watching. To forgive when wronged, to serve without recognition, to love without condition. These were the stones that formed the rock beneath the soul. Every act of obedience was another piece of that unbreakable foundation. The people on the hillside understood that he was not asking for admiration, but for allegiance. His words carried both tenderness and authority, the tone of a teacher who loved deeply, yet refused to soften the truth. Those who followed him would face storms, but he was offering them a way to endure, not by escaping life's pain, but by standing firm within it. The call to build on the rock was a call to live deliberately, to align every thought, every decision, every moment with divine truth. He contrasted the wise builder with the foolish one who chose sand, quick to construct, slow to endure. The foolish builder sought convenience, avoiding the effort required to dig deep. His house looked fine until the storm came, and then, with a crash, it fell. Jesus' words carried the sound of warning, but also of invitation. Every person could choose their foundation. Every soul could begin building again, no matter how many times the house had fallen. Grace made rebuilding possible, truth made it strong, and love made it last. Those listening that day could almost feel the wind in his parable, hear the rain against their own hearts. They knew he was not speaking only of others, but of them. Each person stood before two choices, to live by his words or to merely admire them. To live by them was to find life itself. His message was not a sermon to remember, but a foundation to build upon, one that would stand when every other structure of pride and fear had crumbled away. When he finished speaking, silence filled the mountain. The people were astonished, not merely by the beauty of his words, but by the power with which he spoke them. He did not speak like the teachers they knew, quoting authorities or hiding behind traditions. He spoke as one who carried the authority of heaven. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their hearts stirred, their minds awakened. They had come as seekers of wisdom, but they left as builders of faith, carrying within them the blueprint for a life that could withstand every storm. His sermon was not just an ancient message, it remains an eternal call to build on truth, to walk the narrow path, to love without measure, to live with integrity, and to anchor life on the solid rock of faith. Every generation must decide whether it will build upon that same foundation or risk the shifting sands of self-reliance. The Sermon on the Mount still speaks because the voice that uttered it was not bound by time. It was the voice of life itself, calling humanity to rise, to trust, to live in the light that never fades. If these words touched your heart and helped you reflect on the timeless wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount, I invite you to stay connected with this message of hope and faith. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new reflections that inspire your spirit and strengthen your walk in truth. Like this video to let others know it spoke to you, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections may encourage someone who needs light today. And if you know friends or loved ones who could be uplifted by this message, share it with them. Together, let's spread these words of peace, love, and truth, letting their light continue to reach hearts across the world.